They thought the water would hide everything, but when the lake dried up, the bones of two children resurfaced, and with them, a truth buried for 50 years. What came next would shake an entire town to its core. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Detective Evelyn Shaw stood over a crime scene in Dallas, cataloging evidence with the precision that had earned her respect throughout the department. The midsummer heat rippled off the pavement as she instructed younger officers, her voice steady despite the wariness of 20 years in homicide. At 45, Evelyn had mastered emotional detachment, a skill she learned from watching her father, the legendary Daniel Shaw, whose photograph still sat on her desk next to his old service medal. Her life had a comfortable rhythm, solving cases, filing reports, and occasionally having dinner with colleagues who respected her too much to ask about her persistent silence. The notification came while she was finishing paperwork. A text from an old academy friend now working in Central Texas. Drought-exposed remains at Coldwater Reservoir. Child-sized. Possible match to the Danner case. Evelyn's hand froze over her keyboard. Coldwater. The town where she spent only the first 8 years of her life. The case that consumed her father until his death 3 years ago. She dismissed the first flutter of unease, telling herself that reopening a 50-year-old case would be professionally interesting, nothing more. She tried not to notice the way her father's photograph seemed to watch her from across the room. That evening, in her sparse apartment, Evelyn retrieved a box she hadn't opened in years. Inside sat a collection of newspaper clippings her father had saved about two children who vanished in 1973, Michael and Claire Danner. The case had been considered solved when their father was arrested, though their bodies were never found. Her own father had been just a young state investigator then, his notes frustratingly incomplete. She remembered how he would sometimes wake, shouting names she didn't recognize, how he would stare at the lake whenever they drove past it. Some cases never really close, he once told her. They just wait for someone brave enough to look again. Sleep eluded Evelyn that night, her dreams filled with fragmented images, muddy water receding, small bones emerging from silt, a pendant glinting in sunlight. She woke before dawn, already knowing what she would do. Her captain raised an eyebrow when she requested a temporary assignment to Coldwater, but he'd known her long enough not to question her instincts. Just remember, he cautioned, old cases have old scars. People don't always want them reopened. She nodded, understanding more than he realized. Her father's reputation had been built on his relentless pursuit of truth, and she'd spent her career trying to honor that legacy. Packing took less than an hour. Clothes, laptop, case files, and a single photograph of her father at her police academy graduation. Evelyn told herself this was just another case, that her interest was purely professional. But as she loaded her car for the 3-hour drive to Coldwater, she couldn't ignore the feeling that she wasn't just chasing a case, she was chasing ghosts. Her father's ghost, the ghosts of two children, and perhaps something darker that had been waiting in the parched earth of Coldwater for half a century to be found. The highway stretched before her, empty in the early morning light. Evelyn turned on the radio, but quickly switched it off, preferring the silence. This case needed clarity, focus. Her mind ran through the facts. Two siblings vanished during a storm in 1973. Their father arrested days later. Case closed without bodies ever being found. And now, 50 years later, drought had revealed what water had concealed. As the miles passed, Evelyn felt a strange pull, as if Coldwater had been waiting for her all these years, as if the truth had been patient, knowing she would eventually come looking for it. The Texas sun beat mercilessly on Coldwater Reservoir as Evelyn arrived, the once expansive lake now reduced to a muddy basin surrounded by cracked earth. Yellow police tape cordoned off the northeastern section, where a county work crew first spotted what they thought was an animal skeleton. What they found instead were two partial human skeletons, small enough to belong to children, alongside a rusted bicycle frame partially buried in the dried mud. Evelyn stood at the edge of the site, watching as forensic technicians carefully sifted through the silt. The drought had revealed what water kept hidden for 50 years, and something inside her, some inheritance from her father perhaps, told her this was where her life would pivot. Detective Shaw, a lean man with sun-weathered skin, approached, forensics kit in hand. Luis Ortega, I'm heading the recovery team. He hesitated, studying her face. You look like him, your father. I was just starting when he came back through here in '98, still asking questions. This surprised Evelyn. Her father never mentioned returning to cold water after they'd moved away. Ortega continued, the county wants this wrapped quick. They're saying the bones could be indigenous, prehistoric even. His expression suggested he didn't believe it. When Ortega led her to the evidence tent and carefully removed a small plastic bag, Evelyn's breath caught. Inside was a tarnished silver pendant with the initial CD, Claire Danner, exactly matching the description in the original missing persons report. Sheriff Hayes greeted Evelyn at the temporary command post with thinly veiled hostility, his handshake perfunctory. We appreciate Dallas sending someone, but this isn't exactly a priority case. He slid a folder across the table, the official paperwork from 1973, showing Roy Danner's arrest following his children's disappearance. Man was a drunk with PTSD from Nam. Case was solid. But when Evelyn asked to see witness statements and evidence logs, Hayes claimed most records were lost in a courthouse flood in the '90s. It was a convenient explanation that raised her suspicions immediately. Those kids' daddy is long dead now anyway, Hayes added. Died in prison in '86. As he spoke, Evelyn noticed a photograph on his wall, a much younger Hayes standing beside her father at some county function. Neither man was smiling. That evening, Evelyn checked into the only motel in town, a faded establishment whose signs still advertised color TV as an amenity. The desk clerk, an elderly woman with careful eyes, studied Evelyn's ID too long. Shaw, she said finally. Any relation to Daniel Shaw, the investigator? When Evelyn confirmed, the woman's expression shifted. This town has long memories, dear. Some might not be happy to see another Shaw asking questions. Before Evelyn could inquire further, the phone rang, and the clerk turned away, leaving Evelyn with the unsettling feeling that her arrival had already rippled through cold water's still waters. Alone in her room, Evelyn spread out what little she had, copies of her father's personal notes on the case, the official timeline of the children's disappearance, photographs of the reservoir before it was filled in 1970. She created a rough timeline on the motel notepad. June 15, 1973, Michael and Claire Danner disappear while allegedly watching a storm. June 16, bicycle found. June 18, Roy Danner arrested. What happened in those critical hours? What evidence led so quickly to Roy's arrest? And why did her father keep returning to this case decades later? As she stared at the pendant photo, CD clearly visible despite years underwater, Evelyn knew with absolute certainty that finding the truth about the Danner children meant finding the truth about Daniel Shaw as well. The want crystallized. She needed answers, not just for the case, but for herself. Outside her window, the lights of Coldwater, few and far between, winked against the Texas night. Somewhere in this town, someone knew what had happened to those children. Someone remembered the truth. And someone, Evelyn was increasingly certain, didn't want that truth coming to light after all these years. The Coldwater County Records Office occupied the basement of the municipal building, a windowless room where time seemed suspended in a haze of dust and fluorescent lighting. The clerk, a man named Marvin with suspenders and nicotine-stained fingers, seemed surprised when Evelyn requested all available files on the 1973 Danner investigation. Those would be in the restricted section, he said, eyeing her credentials skeptically. Need the sheriff's authorization. It took 3 phone calls, 2 forms, and a barely veiled threat of a state-issued warrant before Marvin reluctantly led her to a back room where metal filing cabinets stood like sentinels. The Danner file was thin, suspiciously thin, with key interviews missing and evidence logs showing obvious gaps. Most tellingly, her father's preliminary report ended mid-sentence on page 4, the remaining pages nowhere to be found. Evelyn's next stop was the local newspaper office, where archives of the Coldwater Chronicle were kept in metal filing cabinets and on microfiche. The editor, a woman named Justine Carroll with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, regarded Evelyn with open curiosity. "Another Shaw," she said, offering coffee from a pot that looked as old as the building. "Your father spent hours here, you know," said newspapers tell what official reports leave out. With Justine's help, Evelyn uncovered the public narrative of the case. Front-page stories about the missing children, quotes from neighbors about Roy Danner's drinking, and then, abruptly, the story vanished from the headlines after his arrest. No trial coverage, no follow-up, just silence. In the margins of one article, Evelyn found a handwritten note in her father's distinctive script. "Blue County truck, no plates, witness account missing." The Coldwater Diner became Evelyn's unofficial office, a place where she could spread files across a corner booth and observe the town's rhythms. On her 3rd day, a weathered man in his 70s approached her table uninvited and sat down. "Walter Dre," he introduced himself, voice gravelly from what sounded like decades of cigarettes. "I knew your daddy, and I knew what happened to those kids." He glanced nervously around the diner, then slid a yellowed business card across the table. "Not here, tonight." Before Evelyn could respond, he was gone, leaving only the card with an address on the outskirts of town. Later, when she mentioned Walter Dre to Sheriff Hayes, the man's expression darkened. "Dre's not reliable. Terminal cancer's got his mind wandering. Been spinning tales for years." That evening, Evelyn drove down a rutted dirt road to a small house surrounded by mesquite trees. Walter Dre sat on his porch, oxygen tank at his side, watching her approach with rheumy eyes. "Figured you'd come," he said, gesturing to a chair. "Not much time left for me, so I'll get right to it. I was working road maintenance that night, the night the Danner kids went missing. Saw them on that bike heading toward the ridge. But I saw something else too. A county truck. Blue. No plates. Heading the same direction about 20 minutes later. His breathing became labored, and he paused to adjust his oxygen. Told the deputies back then. Report disappeared. Month later, I got transferred to the other side of the county. Your daddy was the only one who listened. Years later, he found something too, something in the intake chamber. Day after he went down there, he left town with you in tow. Never saw him again." Back in her motel room, Evelyn added Walter's account to her growing timeline, the unfamiliar pieces of Coldwater's past slowly forming a pattern she couldn't yet interpret. Her phone rang. The forensic lab with preliminary findings on the remains. The bones belonged to 2 children, a boy and a girl, approximately aged 13 and 10, who died around 1973. Cause of death, blunt force trauma, consistent with a fall or crush injury, not homicide. The science was dismantling the official story piece by piece. As Evelyn hung up, her gaze fell on the motel room door where someone had slipped a note underneath. Written in block letters, "Shaw should have stayed away, so should you." The unfamiliar situation grew more treacherous by the hour, and Evelyn realized she'd disturbed a carefully maintained silence that had preserved Coldwater's secrets for half a century. Evelyn picked up the note with a tissue, preserving any fingerprints, though she doubted she'd find any. Whoever was watching her wouldn't have made such an obvious mistake. She folded the paper carefully into an evidence bag, her mind racing. The warning only confirmed she was onto something. If Coldwater wanted her gone, she was asking the right questions. The county vehicle records occupied 3 dusty filing cabinets in a storage room that smelled of mildew and neglect. Evelyn flipped methodically through maintenance logs from 1973, searching for any blue truck assigned to the Public Works Department around the time of the Danner children's disappearance. The tedious work paid off when she found records for a 1969 Ford F-250, county asset number 317, listed as decommissioned accident on June 18, 1973, the same day Roy Danner was arrested. The coincidence was too perfect to ignore. When she inquired about the truck's current location, the records clerk initially claimed ignorance, then reluctantly admitted that decommissioned vehicles from that era were often left in the county junkyard behind the maintenance shed. "Nothing out there but rust and rattlesnakes now," he warned, but Evelyn was already requesting directions. The junkyard was an automotive graveyard. Dozens of vehicles in various states of decay, arranged in haphazard rows beneath the merciless Texas sun. Evelyn walked the narrow paths between rusted hulks, sweat soaking her shirt, searching methodically for a blue Ford truck. After 2 hours, she was ready to admit defeat when she noticed a tarp-covered shape partially hidden behind a collapsed shed. Pulling back the sun-bleached canvas revealed the faded blue paint of a county truck, its windshield shattered and front end crushed as if from a significant impact. The asset number on the door read 317. Inside the glove compartment, hidden beneath decades of dust and debris, Evelyn found something extraordinary. A County Works Department badge from 1973, bearing the name Thomas Cotter, a man never mentioned in any of the original investigation reports. Sheriff Hayes was visibly agitated when Evelyn presented her findings, his weathered face flushing as he paced his office. Cotter was just the maintenance supervisor, probably lost the badge months before. But his discomfort was telling, especially when Evelyn revealed she'd already requested personnel files for Cotter and cross-referenced them with Project 9A, a name she discovered in her father's notes. Hayes' reaction was immediate and visceral. "Where did you hear about that?" he demanded, voice dropping to a harsh whisper. When Evelyn mentioned requesting state archives, Hayes' demeanor shifted entirely. "Look, Detective, Coldwater's a small town. We've made peace with our past. Sometimes old tragedies are better left buried." It wasn't a threat, not exactly, but the warning was clear enough. Later that day, Evelyn found her motel room had been searched. Drawers left slightly open, papers imperceptibly rearranged. Undeterred, Evelyn drove to Austin the next morning, where state archives might hold information on Project 9A. The archivist initially claimed no record existed, but Evelyn's badge and a carefully worded reminder about obstruction of justice produced results. 3 hours later, she sat in a climate-controlled reading room, examining classified documents that revealed Project 9A as a state-sanctioned program active in several Texas counties in the early 1970s. Its purpose: to suppress information about accidents and failures during reservoir construction, to prevent economic collapse in struggling rural areas. Coldwater was one of 5 communities where containment actions were authorized. Among the signatories on the final directive was a name that made Evelyn's blood run cold: Daniel Shaw, state investigator. Adapting to each new revelation required Evelyn to recalibrate her understanding of both the case and her father. That evening, she drove to the ridge where the Danner children were allegedly heading to watch the storm. The drought had transformed the landscape, revealing shorelines unseen for decades. As twilight settled over Coldwater, Evelyn noticed an unusual concrete structure, partially exposed by the receding water, some kind of intake chamber for the reservoir system. Climbing down the embankment, she discovered the entrance was secured with a padlock that looked surprisingly new compared to the weathered concrete. Someone had been here recently. Using her flashlight to examine the structure more closely, Evelyn found scratch marks on the lock, and more disturbing, what appeared to be a small footprint preserved in the hardened mud beside the chamber. A child's footprint, decades old, but protected from erosion by the structure itself. She photographed everything, the pieces of the puzzle slowly assembling into a picture far different from the official narrative that sent Roy Danner to prison. The sun was setting as Evelyn climbed back up the embankment, her mind racing with questions. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched, that eyes tracked her movements from somewhere among the scrub brush and mesquite trees dotting the ridge. Turning suddenly, she caught a glimpse of movement, but whether animal or human, she couldn't tell. The name Thomas Cotter led Evelyn to a nursing home in a neighboring county, where the former maintenance supervisor had resided for the past decade. Now 83 and suffering from advanced dementia, Cotter spent most days staring silently at a television, occasionally muttering phrases that made sense only to him. The nurse warned Evelyn that lucidity came rarely and unpredictably. But Evelyn sat patiently by his side, showing him photographs of the Danner children. The badge, the intake chamber. For nearly an hour, there was no response. Then, as she was preparing to leave, Cotter suddenly gripped her wrist with surprising strength. "The kids weren't supposed to be there," he whispered, eyes momentarily clear. "Chamber collapsed. County said fix it quiet. Shaw's orders, state orders. Had to move the bodies. Had to make it look like something else." His gaze drifted again, the moment of clarity passing like a brief break in clouds, leaving Evelyn with a chilling confirmation of her growing suspicions. Back in Coldwater, Evelyn sought out Helen Danner, the children's mother, who allegedly left town shortly after her husband's arrest. County records showed she relocated to Oklahoma, changing her name to Helen Marshall after a remarriage. After 3 days of calls, Evelyn secured a phone interview with the now elderly woman. "I never believed Roy hurt those children," Helen said, her voice thin but resolute. "But a man from the state, he came to our house after Roy was arrested. Said if I ever questioned the official story, I'd be implicated too. Said it was better for everyone if I just started over somewhere else." When Evelyn asked if the man identified himself, Helen's answer sent a shiver through her. Young fellow with kind eyes but a hard mouth. Said his name was Daniel Shaw. The conversation ended abruptly when Helen, overcome with emotion, hung up, leaving Evelyn to confront yet another piece of evidence suggesting her father's complicity in a decades-long cover-up. Sheriff Hayes' resistance intensified as Evelyn's investigation proceeded, culminating in an official request for her to conclude her work and return to Dallas. "There's nothing more to find here," he insisted during a tense meeting in his office. "Just old bones and older mistakes." But his attempt to stonewall her backfired when Evelyn received an unexpected ally, Justine Carroll from the newspaper, who arrived at the meeting with microfiche records showing the original unredacted article about the Blue County truck. "My father kept copies of everything," Justine explained, "including the version that never made it to print." Hayes's face paled as Justine revealed her father was the Chronicle's editor in 1973. Forced to pull the story after pressure from county officials. "Dad never forgave himself for caving," Justine said. "Truth has a long memory in Coldwater, Sheriff. Longer than 50 years of silence." Armed with Justine's documentation and Cotter's testimony, Evelyn secured a warrant to excavate the intake chamber site. The operation drew spectators, curious townspeople, reporters from neighboring counties, and county officials watching nervously from their vehicles. The excavation proceeded methodically until 6 feet below the surface. Workers uncovered a section of collapsed concrete, and beneath it, additional human remains. More disturbingly, they found children's personal effects, a small backpack with the name Michael still faintly visible, a child-sized shoe, and a second pendant matching the one found earlier. Ortega, overseeing the forensics team, confirmed what the evidence had been suggesting. These children died in a structural collapse, not at their father's hands. Someone moved the bodies afterward, tried to hide them in the reservoir basin. That night, returning to her motel after 16 hours at the excavation site, Evelyn found her car's tires slashed and a note on her windshield. "Leave now or join your father." The threat only strengthened her resolve, but it also confirmed her growing certainty that whatever happened in 1973 still mattered desperately to someone in Coldwater. In her room, She reviewed her father's personal notes again, focusing on a cryptic reference to secondary chamber, sealed records. The adaptation to Coldwater's hostile environment was complete. Evelyn no longer saw herself as an outside investigator, but as part of the landscape itself, a necessary disruption to stagnant waters that had concealed truth for too long. Tomorrow, she'd find the secondary chamber, whatever the cost. The truth about the Danner children and about Daniel Shaw waited in the darkness beneath Coldwater's parched surface. "You're just like him, you know," said a voice from her doorway. Evelyn whirled to find Ortega leaning against the frame. "Sorry, didn't mean to startle you." Door was open. He held up a folder. "Found something else in the chamber debris. Thought you'd want to see it right away." The secondary chamber proved difficult to locate, its existence scrubbed from official county blueprints. Evelyn spent days comparing satellite imagery from different decades, looking for anomalies in the landscape around the reservoir. The breakthrough came unexpectedly during a conversation with Walter Dre, who mentioned the old storm tunnel that connected the intake chamber to a secondary maintenance area built into the ridge itself. "They sealed it after the accident," he rasped between labored breaths. "Poured concrete over the entrance. But there was another way in, through the Fire Road access point." With Dre's directions and a county survey map from 1970, Evelyn located the hidden entrance, a rusted metal door disguised as an electrical junction box, half hidden by decades of vegetation growth. Breaking the lock required a warrant, which Hayes reluctantly provided after Evelyn threatened to involve state authorities. The metal door groaned open to reveal a narrow concrete tunnel, its walls streaming with moisture and age. Evelyn and Ortega proceeded cautiously, their flashlights cutting through darkness undisturbed for decades. The tunnel extended nearly 50 yards before opening into a circular chamber approximately 20 feet in diameter. What they found inside sent a chill through them both. Filing cabinets, their contents remarkably preserved in the climate-controlled environment, and a wall of photographs documenting Project 9A. One image showed the intake chamber under construction, with annotations indicating structural concerns that were apparently ignored. Another showed county officials meeting with state representatives, including a much younger Daniel Shaw, his expression grave as he examined blueprints. The filing cabinets contained what the main investigation files lacked: complete records of the Danner case, including the truth of what happened that stormy June night in 1973. According to internal memos, Michael and Claire Danner had indeed ridden their bicycle to the ridge to watch the storm, but they'd ventured onto the newly constructed intake platform, not realizing the danger. The platform, built with substandard materials to cut costs, collapsed, plunging the children into the concrete chamber below. County workers, including Thomas Cotter, discovered the tragedy the next morning, but reported it directly to county administration rather than law enforcement. What followed was the first implementation of Project 9A protocols, the suppression of an infrastructure failure that would have bankrupted the struggling county with lawsuits and halted federal funding for the reservoir project. Most disturbing of all, Evelyn found her father's signature on multiple documents: authorization for the secure containment of the incident, approval for the arrest of Roy Danner as a diversionary suspect, and the directive to create a sealed record separate from official channels. In his official capacity as a state investigator, Daniel Shaw had become the architect of a cover-up that sent an innocent man to prison, drove a grieving mother from her home, and buried the truth alongside 2 children's remains. The revelation hit Evelyn with physical force, sending her stumbling back against the damp wall of the chamber. Her father, the man whose principles had shaped her entire career, whose pursuit of justice she had tried to emulate, had participated in perhaps the most complete perversion of justice she'd ever encountered. The most damning evidence came in a sealed folder marked Executive Authorization, Eyes Only. Inside, Evelyn found photographs documenting the removal and relocation of the children's bodies, clinical in their detail and horrifying in their implications. The final photograph showed Daniel Shaw himself standing beside the reservoir site where the remains were hidden, his expression unreadable in the harsh flash of the camera. Attached to the photograph was a handwritten note in her father's handwriting. "May God forgive what necessity makes us do. I fear I never will." Evelyn had found exactly what she wanted, the complete truth about the Danner children's fate and her father's role in concealing it. But as she and Ortega carefully documented and collected the evidence, the victory felt hollow, tainted by the revelation that the moral compass she inherited might have been irreparably broken long before it was passed to her. "You okay?" Ortega asked, watching her face as she stared at her father's handwriting. Evelyn didn't answer immediately, her eyes fixed on the words that had shattered her understanding of the man she'd spent her life trying to emulate. "Let's finish documenting everything," she said finally. "There's more here than just one case." The evidence from the secondary chamber proved irrefutable. Documentation, photographs, internal memos, all pointing to a coordinated cover-up spanning multiple agencies. Evelyn secured the materials in the Sheriff's Department evidence room, documenting each item meticulously while ignoring Hayes's increasingly agitated presence. "You understand what this means for the town?" he demanded, hovering at her shoulder. "Coldwater barely survives as it is. This kind of scandal, it'll be the end." His concern for the town's reputation over justice for two dead children and their wrongfully convicted father only strengthened Evelyn's resolve. "The truth doesn't expire, Sheriff," she responded, continuing her inventory. "Neither does justice." That night, she called her captain in Dallas to request an extension of her assignment, explaining in careful, professional language the scope of what she'd uncovered. His whistle of disbelief carried clearly over the phone line. "Shaw, you're sitting on a powder keg. Watch your back." The warning proved prescient when Evelyn returned to her motel to find a man waiting in the shadows of the parking lot, Mayor Garrison Marston, Coldwater's chief elected official for the past 15 years. "My office, tomorrow morning. Bring your evidence," he said without preamble. "Some things you should know before this goes public." Despite her wariness, Evelyn agreed to the meeting. The next day, Marston received her in an office that felt trapped in the 1970s, wood paneling and heavy furniture speaking to Coldwater's economic stagnation. "I was just a junior clerk when it happened," Marston began, pouring himself a generous measure of bourbon despite the early hour. Project 9A wasn't just about covering up accidents. It was about survival. 5 counties were selected for reservoir development, federal money that would save dying towns. The condition was perfect safety records, 0 incidents. 1 accident would mean project termination, funds diverted elsewhere. Marston slid a folder across his desk, financial projections from 1973 showing Coldwater's anticipated collapse without the reservoir project. "Your father understood the stakes. 2 children were already dead. Nothing could bring them back. But an entire town could be saved." He sighed heavily, the weight of 5 decades evident in the slump of his shoulders. Daniel Shaw made the hardest choice possible. He sacrificed Roy Danner to save hundreds of families from destitution. Was it right? God, no. Was it the only way? Back then, we thought so. Evelyn listened in stone-faced silence, her expression betraying nothing of the turmoil beneath. When Marston finished, she retrieved a small recorder from her pocket. "Thank you for your candor, Mayor. I'll be adding this statement to the official record." As word spread through Coldwater that the Danner case had been reopened with significant new evidence, Evelyn found the town's reaction divided. Some residents, particularly older ones who remembered 1973, maintained a defensive hostility, closing ranks around the secret they'd collectively kept. Others, especially younger citizens, expressed shock and demanded accountability. The local diner became a battleground of whispered accusations and counter-accusations. Evelyn observed it all with clinical detachment, understanding now why her father moved them away from cold water when she was 8 years old, why he never spoke of his work here, why he sometimes woke shouting in the night. She had what she wanted, the complete truth, but it was a truth that transformed everything she thought she knew about Daniel Shaw. The final piece of the puzzle arrived unexpectedly in a package delivered to her motel, a sealed envelope that had been held by Walter Dre's attorney with instructions to release it upon his death. The news that Dre passed away in his sleep the night before brought a moment of solemn pause to Evelyn's investigation. Inside the envelope, she found a handwritten letter from her father to Walter, dated just months before Daniel's own death 3 years earlier. "I've carried the weight of cold water every day since 1973, he wrote. Made a deal with the devil to save a town and lost my soul in the process. Roy Danner died in prison, an innocent man who became the sacrifice for hundreds. I've spent decades trying to find a way to expose the truth without destroying the town. But there is no clean solution to a crime this profound. I'm leaving this record with you, Walter, because you were the only one who tried to speak up back then. If courage finds me before death does, I'll make this right myself." The letter continued with a detailed confession of Daniel Shaw's role in the cover-up, his attempts to reopen the case decades later when Project 9A was finally decommissioned, and the threats that forced him to back down each time. The final paragraph addressed Evelyn directly. "To my daughter, if she ever reads this, I hope you never discover what happened in Coldwater. But if you do, know that I've lived with this shame so you wouldn't have to. The right path was always clear. I just lacked the courage to walk it. Don't make my mistake. Truth matters more than comfort, more than reputation, more than peace. It's the only thing that matters in the end." Evelyn had what she wanted, complete understanding of both the case and her father's role in it. But the victory tasted of ashes as she realized that in finding her answers, she'd destroyed the foundation upon which she built her entire identity. Evelyn folded the letter carefully and placed it in her evidence file. Outside her window, a gentle rain had begun to fall, the first precipitation Coldwater had seen in months. She watched the drops trace patterns on the glass, feeling neither victory nor defeat, only the weight of a truth that could no longer be contained, like water finding its inevitable path downward. The official report Evelyn submitted to both the Dallas Department and the Texas Rangers ran to 76 pages, meticulously documenting the events of June 1973 and the subsequent 50-year cover-up. It named names, cited evidence, and reconstructed the tragic deaths of Michael and Claire Danner with clinical precision. It also explicitly detailed Daniel Shaw's central role in constructing and maintaining the deception that sent an innocent man to prison. Submitting the report cost Evelyn more than professional detachment. It required her to publicly condemn the man whose moral example shaped her entire career. The Dallas Morning News ran the headline, "Detective Exposes Father's Role in Historic Cover-Up," accompanied by side-by-side photographs of Daniel and Evelyn Shaw. Her captain called to inform her she was being placed on administrative leave pending an internal review. "It's just procedure," he assured her, but they both recognized the professional consequences of exposing systemic corruption involving multiple agencies. Coldwater's reaction to the report was swift and polarized. Mayor Marston announced his resignation, citing health concerns that fooled no one. Sheriff Hayes issued a statement acknowledging historical errors in judgment while deflecting personal responsibility. The town council held an emergency session that devolved into shouting and recriminations. Outside the municipal building, two distinct groups of citizens formed: older residents holding signs reading "Coldwater Survives," and a larger contingent of younger citizens with placards demanding justice for the Danners. Evelyn observed the division from her motel window, understanding that she had fractured the carefully maintained silence that held this community together for generations. The price of truth included becoming a pariah to half the town and an uncomfortable hero to the rest. The personal cost became evident when Evelyn received a call from her mother, now living in Arizona, who had seen the news reports. "How could you do this to your father's memory?" she demanded, voice breaking. "He was a good man who carried so much weight for all of us." The conversation deteriorated from there, ending with her mother's pronouncement that Evelyn was no longer welcome in her home. Colleagues from Dallas grew distant, their messages becoming perfunctory or ceasing altogether. The thin blue line had always protected its own, and by exposing her father, Evelyn had crossed a boundary few in law enforcement would contemplate. She found herself increasingly isolated, her hotel room becoming both refuge and prison, as the case consumed what remained of her personal life. The heaviest blow came when the Texas Rangers' review of her report triggered a broader investigation into Project 9A, revealing that Coldwater wasn't the only community where accidents were covered up. 2 other towns had similar incidents resulting in wrongful convictions. The mounting evidence suggested that Daniel Shaw wasn't merely complicit. He was instrumental in designing the protocol used across multiple sites. Evelyn's hotel room wall became a map of her father's involvement. Each new revelation, another pin in the constellation of his deception. She stopped sleeping more than a few hours at a time, existing on coffee and vending machine food as she compulsively pursued every thread, as if complete understanding might somehow lessen the betrayal. Ortega, visiting to deliver new forensic results, found her surrounded by documents, eyes hollowed by exhaustion. "You found the truth," he said gently. "Maybe that's enough." But Evelyn shook her head. "It's not enough to know what happened. I need to understand how he lived with it." The price of truth culminated in a letter from the police commissioner, informing Evelyn that while her investigation was technically sound, her personal connection to the case represented an undisclosed conflict of interest. The carefully worded document stopped short of termination, but made clear that her future in the department was precarious at best. That night, alone in her motel room with the walls closing in, Evelyn finally allowed herself to break down. The sobs racked her body, releasing 50 years of secrets, not just her father's, but those of an entire town, of families who built lives on the foundation of a terrible lie, of children whose deaths were erased for the greater good. The truth had cost her nearly everything: her professional standing, her family relationships, her belief in the system she served, and most painfully, her faith in the man who taught her what justice meant. As dawn broke over Coldwater, Evelyn faced the hollow victory of complete knowledge and its devastating price. Morning brought no relief, only a dull ache behind her eyes and the taste of stale coffee as she packed her belongings. She wasn't finished, not by a long shot, but the weight of what she'd uncovered pressed down on her like the collapsed concrete that had taken those children's lives. She needed to be strategic now, careful about her next steps. The truth had cost her dearly, but she was her father's daughter in one respect at least. Once she started down this path, there would be no turning back. The threats began subtly: a flat tire, misdelivered mail, disconnected calls. Evelyn initially dismissed these as coincidences until the night someone broke into her motel room while she was interviewing a former county employee. Nothing was taken, but her case files were rearranged in a deliberate pattern, a warning that someone was watching, someone with access to her space. She reported the incident to Hayes, who assigned a deputy to keep an eye on things, with such obvious insincerity that Evelyn immediately purchased additional door locks and a small safe for crucial evidence. The message was clear: Coldwater protected its secrets, even 50 years later, and there were those who considered Daniel Shaw's daughter an acceptable casualty in maintaining silence. The escalation came without warning. Leaving the diner after a late dinner, Evelyn found herself followed by a pickup truck with its headlights off, maintaining a consistent distance down the empty county road. When she pulled over to confront the driver, the truck accelerated, forcing her onto the shoulder before speeding away into the darkness. The next day, returning from the excavation site, she discovered her motel room door ajar. Inside, nothing appeared disturbed except for her father's photograph, now positioned face down on the bedside table. The implicit threat that exploring Daniel Shaw's past put his memory at risk only strengthened Evelyn's determination. She moved to a different motel 20 miles away, using a colleague's credit card, and continued her investigation with increased caution. The psychological toll mounted as Evelyn found herself increasingly isolated. Former allies became scarce. Ortega was reassigned to a case in another county. Justine Carroll received pressure from the newspaper's advertisers to focus on community-positive stories, and even Walter Dre's family requested she stop using his testimony, following anonymous threats. The walls closed in further when her captain called to inform her that complaints had been filed questioning her mental stability and fitness for duty. "They're saying you're obsessed with clearing your father's name," he explained awkwardly. "That you're fabricating evidence to make him look worse so you can be the hero who solves everything." The irony was so bitter, Evelyn nearly laughed. She was being accused simultaneously of both attacking and defending her father's legacy. The price of truth now included her professional reputation, carefully built over 20 years of exemplary service. The most direct threat arrived on a Tuesday afternoon as Evelyn examined new evidence from the secondary chamber. A black SUV with tinted windows pulled alongside her in the municipal building parking lot. The passenger window lowered to reveal an older man in an expensive suit, his expression pleasant, but his eyes cold. "Miss Shaw," he said, eschewing her professional title deliberately. "I represent certain state interests concerned with historical records management. Your investigation has exceeded its sanctioned parameters." He extended a business card identifying him as James Mercer, special counsel to the State Historical Commission, an entity Evelyn knew had no enforcement authority. Project 9A was decommissioned decades ago, but its security classifications remain active. "You're entering waters that could result in federal charges." When Evelyn responded that covering up deaths wasn't a matter of historical record, but of criminal justice, Mercer's pleasant demeanor vanished. "Your father understood necessary compromises. Pity that quality wasn't inherited." The SUV pulled away, leaving Evelyn with the unsettling realization that her investigation had attracted attention far beyond Goldwater's boundaries. That night, Evelyn received a call from an unlisted number. The voice was electronically disguised, but the message was chillingly clear. "Final warning, walk away now. Next time won't be a warning." Hours later, she was awakened by the smell of smoke. Her motel room door had been doused with accelerant and set alight. A low-level blaze meant to frighten rather than harm, but a dramatic escalation nonetheless. As firefighters contained the small fire, Evelyn stood in the parking lot, watching flames illuminate the faces of curious onlookers. Among them she noticed Sheriff Hayes, ostensibly there in an official capacity, but making no effort to approach her. Their eyes met across the distance, and in that moment, Evelyn understood that the price of truth had risen to include her safety. The threats had transformed from intimidation to potentially lethal action. Goldwater had decided she was an acceptable sacrifice to protect 5 decades of carefully maintained silence. Evelyn knew it was time to change tactics. Staying alone had made her vulnerable. She needed allies, visibility, protection. Pulling out her phone, she made 3 calls, one to a former colleague at the Texas Rangers, one to a journalist friend at a national news outlet, and one to Justine Carroll. Time to go public, she told each of them, with everything. If Goldwater and Project 9A wanted to operate in shadows, she would flood those shadows with light. The break-in at her temporary residence forced Evelyn to recalibrate her approach to the investigation. Rather than retreat, she went on the offensive, requesting state police protection and filing formal reports about the escalating threats. The publicity made her a less attractive target for intimidation and created a paper trail that would immediately implicate local officials if anything happened to her. With this protection in place, Evelyn returned to the evidence with renewed focus. Something had been nagging at her, a discrepancy in the records from the secondary chamber. Several documents referenced auxiliary storage for secondary materials, a location never specified in the blueprints or official documentation. If Project 9A was methodical enough to create hidden chambers for records, what else might they have concealed? The answer came from an unexpected source, Mayor Marston, who appeared at her door late one evening, his face haggard and eyes bloodshot. "I'm dying," he announced without preamble. "Cancer. 3 months, maybe less." He pushed past her into the room, collapsing into a chair. "I can't take this to my grave, too." What followed was a confession 50 years in the making. As a junior clerk in 1973, Marston had been tasked with documenting the containment of the Danner incident. But the Danner children weren't the only victims of the faulty intake chamber. 2 weeks earlier, a similar incident had claimed 2 other children, Eli and Maren Foster, siblings from a migrant worker family passing through Coldwater. Their deaths had been easier to conceal. No local connections, parents who barely spoke English, no fixed address. "They're still there," Marston whispered. "In the tertiary chamber. The bodies, the evidence, all of it." Daniel sealed it himself, said no one should ever have to make the choice he did twice in 1 month. Before dawn, Evelyn and a state police escort met Marston at the reservoir. The former mayor, moving with the careful deliberation of a man in constant pain, led them along an overgrown path to what appeared to be a natural rock formation on the ridge above the secondary chamber. "False front," he explained, pulling away sections of convincingly molded concrete to reveal a steel door with a combination lock. "Daniel's birthday," he said as he spun the dial. He said that way he'd never forget what was inside. The door opened with a groan of neglected hinges, revealing a small chamber carved directly into the limestone of the ridge. Unlike the meticulously preserved secondary chamber, this space showed signs of hasty creation. Rough walls, minimal reinforcement, a single light fixture dangling from exposed wiring. What they found inside confirmed Marston's confession. 2 small sets of remains, still partially clothed, laid with a strange tenderness on concrete slabs. Beside them, a metal filing cabinet contained photographs of Eli and Maren Foster, death certificates listing drowning accident as the cause, and signed statements from their parents accepting a cash settlement of $5,000 and agreeing to relocate. Most damning of all was a handwritten note from Daniel Shaw to Thomas Cotter. "This can never happen again. I've made arrangements for the Foster children. No one else will ever know they existed in Coldwater. God help me for what necessity has made me do." The tertiary chamber represented the darkest secret of Project 9A, not just the cover-up of accidents, but the complete erasure of children whose deaths were deemed less important, less worthy of even the twisted justice applied to the Danner siblings. As the state forensics team processed this new scene, Evelyn sat alone on the ridge, overlooking the drought-stricken reservoir. The familiar weight of investigation, cataloging evidence, establishing timelines, documenting findings, provided structure amid emotional chaos. Her father's complicity was now beyond question, the scale of his deception larger than she could have imagined. Yet beneath her professional detachment, Evelyn found herself returning to the last line of his note. "God help me for what necessity has made me do." Not justification, but acknowledgement of a moral weight carried for decades. She recalled his nightmares, his sudden departure from law enforcement when she was 12, his obsessive focus on child victims throughout his later career. Daniel Shaw had returned to a familiar situation, life as a respected investigator. But he had returned changed, carrying the burden of Coldwater's secrets. The foster children's discovery transformed the investigation from a local cold case to a state-level inquiry. Additional rangers arrived. The medical examiner's office sent a specialized team, and national media began reporting on the Reservoir Children story. Through it all, Evelyn maintained professional distance, providing evidence and testimony with methodical precision. When a Dallas news crew requested an interview about her father's role, she declined without explanation. Her captain called with unexpected news. Her administrative leave had been lifted following a review that found her investigation exemplary, despite personal connections to the case. The familiar routines of professional life began to reassert themselves, offering the comfort of known parameters after weeks of escalating threats and discoveries. But as Evelyn returned to the procedures and protocols that had defined her career, she knew she had been fundamentally altered by what she found beneath Coldwater's parched earth. The familiar situation to which she returned was rendered unfamiliar by the weight of complete knowledge. Knowledge of what fear and necessity can make good people do. Knowledge her father carried alone for 50 years. "You've done good work here," her captain told her over the phone. "But I need to know, are you okay?" Evelyn looked out at the reservoir, where excavation teams continued their careful work. "No," she said honestly, "but I will be." The press conference was held on the steps of the Coldwater Municipal Building. Its backdrop, the half-empty reservoir that yielded so many secrets. Evelyn stood before a forest of microphones, her posture military straight, her expression composed despite the cameras capturing every nuance. 50 years ago, she began, 4 children died in accidents related to the construction of this reservoir. Their deaths were concealed as part of Project 9A, a state-sanctioned program designed to protect economic development at any cost. Today, we're announcing formal charges against 8 surviving individuals involved in that cover-up. She delivered the facts with precision. Names, dates, specific charges, while cameras flashed and reporters scribbled notes. Only those watching closely might notice how her voice softened imperceptibly when she stated, among those responsible was state investigator Daniel Shaw, now deceased, who authorized and implemented critical aspects of the concealment. The investigation's conclusion brought a strange duality to Coldwater. On one hand, there was public outrage. Protesters gathered daily outside the homes of those charged, particularly former Sheriff Hayes, who faced multiple counts of evidence tampering and obstruction of justice. On the other hand, there was a palpable sense of relief, as if a half-century of held breath had finally been released. Evelyn observed both reactions with newfound understanding. The town needed both justice and healing, and neither was possible without first facing the truth. When Mayor Marston, now in hospice care, called to thank her for lifting the curse from Coldwater, Evelyn recognized the statement as more than melodrama. Some burdens can only be released through acknowledgement, no matter how painful the process. The memorial service for all 4 children, Michael and Claire Danner, Eli and Maren Foster, drew hundreds from Coldwater and surrounding communities. Held beside the reservoir where their remains were finally recovered, the ceremony featured no politicians, no speeches about justice or reconciliation, only the simple reading of their names and ages, followed by a minute of silence. Evelyn stood at the back, a deliberate distance from the officials and media. Helen Danner, now 81 and frail, approached afterward, leaning heavily on a younger woman's arm. "You look like him," she said without introduction. "Your father. He came to see me, about 10 years ago. Told me he was trying to make it right, but couldn't find a way that wouldn't destroy the town." She reached out, briefly touching Evelyn's hand. "He failed. You didn't. Thank you for that." Before Evelyn could respond, Helen turned away, a lifetime of grief evident in the curve of her shoulders. The invitation to return to Dallas arrived formally. A reinstatement to full duty with commendation for exceptional investigative work under adverse conditions. Evelyn accepted without enthusiasm. understanding that while her professional reputation had survived, something fundamental had shifted within her. The idealism that drove her early career, the belief in clear lines between right and wrong, in systems that ultimately serve justice, had been tempered by Coldwater's reality. Her father, the moral compass whose example guided her life's direction, had made choices she still could not fully reconcile. Yet in his failure, she now saw not weakness, but humanity, the impossible weight of decisions that affect hundreds of lives, the corrosive power of secrets maintained for what seems like the greater good. The changed Evelyn Shaw packed her car for the return to Dallas, her father's photograph no longer displayed on the dashboard, but carefully wrapped and placed in her suitcase, a more complicated talisman than it once was. On her final morning in Coldwater, Evelyn visited the intake chamber one last time. The site was now marked with memorial plaques for all 4 children, the area landscaped and accessible to visitors. As she stood in contemplation, Luis Ortega joined her, his forensic work finally complete. "I've been offered a position with the Rangers," he told her. "They were impressed with how we handled this case." Evelyn nodded, genuine in her congratulations, but distant, already transitioning back to the professional detachment that had defined her career. Ortega studied her face before asking, "Was it worth it? Finding the whole truth?" The question gave Evelyn pause. The investigation cost her peace of mind, fractured her understanding of her father, and exposed her to threats and isolation. Yet watching families finally lay their children to rest, seeing justice, however delayed, finally served, she could not deny the necessity of what she uncovered. "Truth is always worth it," she answered finally, "but now I understand why some people can't bear its weight." As she walked away from the chamber, Evelyn Shaw carried Coldwater with her, not just the case files and evidence, but the complex legacy of choices made in fear and necessity, and the understanding that justice, like truth, is rarely pure and never simple. "I'd offer you a job with us," Ortega said, falling into step beside her. "But something tells me you need to get back to Dallas." Evelyn nodded. "I need to figure out what kind of detective I am now," she said quietly. "And what kind of daughter?" 6 months after leaving Coldwater, Evelyn sat in her Dallas apartment reviewing case files for a new investigation. The television murmured in the background, a news update on the sentencing of former Sheriff Hayes, who received 12 years for his role in the cover-up. The reporter mentioned that Mayor Marston died before facing trial, while 3 other officials had entered guilty pleas. The story had faded from national headlines, but its ripples continued. The Texas legislature had opened inquiries into other Project 9A sites, and a historical commission was documenting similar programs across multiple states. On Evelyn's desk sat a letter from the foster children's distant relatives in Mexico, thanking her for finally providing answers about family members they barely knew existed. Beside it rested an invitation to speak at a law enforcement ethics conference, Investigating the Investigators, Moral Challenges in Cold Cases. Rain pattered against the window, a gentle counterpoint to the drought that revealed Coldwater's secrets. Evelyn's apartment showed subtle changes since her return. Her father's photographs remained, but they were now accompanied by news clippings about the case, creating a more complete portrait of the man. On her bookshelf sat a small jar of soil from the reservoir site, a tangible reminder of what remains buried beneath surfaces. Her colleagues had noticed changes too, a new hesitancy before judgment, but deeper consideration of motives behind actions, an occasional defense of decisions others condemned too readily. The absolutes that once guided her approach to justice had been replaced by a more nuanced understanding of human frailty and the complexities of choice. She remained relentlessly principled, but that principle now accommodated the uncomfortable truth that good people can make terrible decisions for reasons that seem necessary in the moment. The phone rang. Her mother, calling for their weekly conversation. Another change since Coldwater. The initial breach had slowly healed as both women navigated their complicated relationships with Daniel Shaw's memory. "I found more of your father's journals," her mother said after preliminary pleasantries. "From right after cold water. I think you should have them." The offer represented significant progress, an acknowledgement that Evelyn's need to understand her father was legitimate, even when that understanding brought pain. "I'd like that," Evelyn responded, hearing the subtle shift in her voice, the professional detective temporarily receding, making space for the daughter still reconciling with complicated truths. After the call, she returned to her case files, but her mind drifted to cold water, to 4 children finally resting in marked graves, to a town slowly rebuilding its foundation on truth rather than convenient fiction. Late that evening, unable to sleep, Evelyn drove to a small lake on the outskirts of Dallas. Standing at the water's edge, she removed from her pocket the pendant that started everything, Claire Danner's CD necklace, officially released from evidence now that all trials were concluded. The simple silver disc caught moonlight as Evelyn considered its journey, 50 years buried in silt, then revealed by drought to trigger revelations that altered countless lives. With deliberate motion, she pulled back her arm and threw the pendant as far as she could into the dark water. Not to hide evidence that time had passed, but to release it, to acknowledge that some things belong to water's memory rather than human justice. The small splash seemed inconsequential, ripples quickly fading into stillness. Yet Evelyn knew how profoundly such small disturbances can alter what lies beneath. Driving home through Dallas streets washed clean by rain, Evelyn reflected on the case that transformed her understanding of both justice and her father. Cold water taught her that truth doesn't exist in isolation. It lives in context, in consequence, in the complex web of human need and fear and hope. Daniel Shaw made choices she still could not fully condone, yet she now carried a deeper understanding of the burden he assumed, the weight that haunted his remaining years. The detective who returned from cold water was not the same woman who arrived seeking simple answers. She moved through the world with greater caution, but also greater compassion, understanding that most people carry secrets beneath their surfaces, and that judgment without context is its own form of injustice. As she parked outside her apartment building, Evelyn glanced at her father's service medal, now hanging from her rearview mirror. "The desert doesn't forget," she murmured, echoing words from her case notes. "It only waits for rain." Like cold water, Evelyn Shaw had been transformed by drought and revelation, parched certainties giving way to a more complex, sustaining truth. The next morning, she woke to news that another reservoir, in another county, had begun to recede due to drought. Already, locals were reporting strange findings along the newly exposed shoreline. Evelyn's phone rang, a Texas ranger she'd worked with on the Danner case. "You heard?" he asked without preamble. "I heard," she replied, already reaching for her keys. Some truths couldn't stay buried forever, and now she was ready to face them, whatever they might be.